I am Frans Cronje. The way to think of me is as an analyst. I work for a South African think tank, the South African Institute of Race Relations, established in the 1920s, an organization with a proud history that rose through the years to become arguably the most influential anti-apartheid think tank in the world. Today, we're a team of around 30 analysts, and we exist in two halves. The one half is the Institute, or the IRR itself, which seeks to do what it's done throughout its history, which is to have an influence on the decisions taken by the South African Cabinet, with a view to creating a society where ordinary people, families, are free to make decisions about how they want to live their own lives. And you'll hear more about that tomorrow morning when my very charismatic colleague, Sihle Ngobesi, is here to address you. This evening I appear for you in another guise, the side of our work that seldom gets into the public domain. Within the Institute, we host a consulting organization, the Center for Risk Analysis, and we work for groups who have an interest in getting a sense of what is happening in our country today, why it's happening, and the Holy Grail is what is going to happen next. And my brief this evening is to answer all three questions for you and to push the envelope on that right out to 2029 and what happens in that year's election, what does the country around us look like. I've done this for a number of years, and I warn you before we set off that some of what you'll see is harsh realities about what we still confront and the challenges that we need to overcome. And the challenge for me this evening in front of every audience that I stand is essentially the same thing. On the one hand, to give you a non-sugar-coated, hard analysis of the obstacles and the challenges that we still face before we can become a fundamentally free and open and more equal society, and at the same time, to offer you the sense that if we commit to that, it is an objective that we can reach. To give you a sense of that, a story we start many of the briefings off with is that of what happened in our country on the 15th of August, 1985. And if you're old enough, you'll remember what that was. It was Pierre Botha who has gone to Durban to address the National Party in what will become famous as the Rubicon speech. In the run-up to that, the Foreign Minister, Pik Botha, has been telling the world, don't worry, we know we're in trouble and we're prepared to change. The context wasn't very different to today. The economy was performing particularly poorly. There were very high levels of social and political instability in the country. There was a serious dearth of leadership. The Cold War is still on the go. The liberation movements are in prison or in exile. White conscripts are in conflict with young black activists. And Botha appears that night and delivers an aggressive speech in which he essentially says we will not be forced into reform. A quote from that night is that I will not lead white South Africa down the path of abdication and suicide. And it's madness, given the context of the era. This is in the face of economic and political reality. The American banking group, Chase Manhattan, has refused to roll over the country's loans, and we're bankrupt, and this is the answer we get. If someone in my role had appeared before you a few weeks after that and said, for everything you've just heard, the state of the economy, the state of the world, I mean, the Cold War dynamic, my young analysts don't even appreciate quite what an insurmountable obstacle that was. For all that you see around you and for all that you heard on the 15th of August, within a decade, the last leader of the National Party will become the tourism minister in an ANC cabinet that will turn things around to a considerable extent. You would have thought it could not happen. Many things could have happened, but that particular transition from Pierre Botha to Martinus van Schalkwyk was impossible. And I tell that story to our corporate clients in order to keep them with us as we take them through the journey that you're about to go through, to understand that we have a track record of overcoming extraordinary obstacles, and we can overcome these as well. And why we stress the obstacles so much is hard experience. If you think it's going to be easy, if you think they're going to be shortcuts, if you think that Mr. Ramaphosa is coming to power, the Zondo Commission and a few state capture suspects is all that we need in order, lock them away, is all that we need in order to reach our potential, there's in fact a lot more that needs to be done. And my experience has been that people who are not prepared to stare the thing down and appreciate just how great the obstacles are not ultimately in it for the long haul. But if you can face down some of what you see this evening and understand what it means and still understand that we can beat it, then you become a very robust part of South Africa's long-term solution. I start for you as we set out into the future with this piece of information. It's the country's population divided into age groups. In the age group 0 to 14, the first bar, 30% of people. If you add the second one, 15 to 24-year-olds, then 49% of South Africans today are under the age of 24. Go to the latter two, people aged 35 and above, and only 35% of South Africans are now in a position where they are in that age category. We are a very young population, and the importance of that is going to leap out at you time and time again as we start to work through other metrics and indicators. The first of those I show you is the education profile of the country's population. We start in 1995, 2002, 2012, and we work our way through to 2017. The orange line that you're looking at is the share of people in the country who have never been to school. It's inherited at the time of the transition at a level of around 13%, and it has fallen to around 5% today, and it will continue to fall at the country's mortality rate. It's now a very small proportion of people. With matric at all, a figure inherited at just over 25% of people over the age of 20 will increase to a level of just under 45% today. And it surprises many of the groups we talk to, particularly if they sit in relatively genteel surroundings, to think that even today, less than half of South Africans have a matric qualification behind their name, people over the age of 20. And thirdly, I show you the proportion of people with a degree from a university. In 95, we start with a figure of just over 3%, and we'll more than double it to where it sits at 8.1% today. But less than 10% of South Africans today have had the opportunity of that qualification, which is necessary given the changing structure of the country's GDP, to, if you do your bit, assure that you will enter the country's middle classes and enjoy a relatively comfortable standard of living. We stick with the theme of education, and we break it down this time into the country's 4 major race groups. We start with black South Africans. 5%, that's far left, have no education. 37.9% have a matric qualification, still under 4 out of 10, and just over 5 out of every 100 black South Africans have a university degree. The picture for colored South Africans becomes different when we look. The differences become marked when we move to Indian South Africans in grey, and finally the picture for white South Africans. And a striking thing in that latter yellow column is that at 29%, the degree figure for whites over the age of 20 with a degree is low, given the structure of the country's economy and GDP, and it just puts into perspective the implications of the black figure that sits so much lower than that. The problem, in a sense, with the profile arises out of what is happening in the country's schools. I start here for you with the grade 1 class as it was in 2005. And in that year, in grade 1 enrolled, we had just over 1.2 million pupils. 10 years later, they will become the grade 10 class of 2014, and there'll be 1.1 million of them left. So we've lost 100,000 kids over 10 years, which is which is perfectly what you would expect. But 2 years after that, they've become the matric class of 2016. And this time, there are only 700,000 of them left. By the end of that year, writing matric, there were only 600,000. Of those, only 400,000 passed matric, 160,000 passed well enough to go to university. And ultimately, just 55,000 kids out of an initial cohort of 1.2 million passed maths and matric with a grade of 50% or higher. If you consider that that was the country's human capital potential, those 1.2 million children, by the end of their school careers, 4.5% of them, the percentages off the right-hand axis, have done well enough out of the school system to get that degree, which is such an important step towards realizing their expectations of enjoying the comfortable type of middle-class existence that many of us do today. And you see why I warn at the beginning that there's some harsh data here, but we've got to stare it down, accept it, and understand the implications if we are, in the fullness of time, to defeat some of the implications that flow from it. So we have a young population, and it's relatively poorly educated. And of that population that passes through the school system, very few of them graduate at the end of it. But even for kids who've had a few years within the system, there is another problem, which is that of quality. There's an international study of the quality of maths and science in country schools. It ranks 140 countries, 140 the worst, number 1 the best. Mozambique, to give you a sense of perspective, is ranked at 130 for the quality of maths and science education in its schools. South Africa, 128. Chile's at 99, the Philippines 76, Kazakhstan 64, the Russians in the 50s, the UK in the 40s, which is a major policy problem in that part of the world, Indonesia, France, and the United States at 10, bringing up the back end of the top 10. So not only are we not achieving the throughput, but the years that many children spend inside the school system prepare them very poorly to realize again their expectations of a better life. So we've got the young population, we've got the poor education profile, we've got the lack of throughput, and we've then got the challenge of quality. That's reflected in turn in how people participate in South Africa's economy, and the best measure of that, or one of them, is whether they have a job or not. What I show you here is the unemployment rate for people based on their highest level of qualification. So if you've had no education, those a very small proportion of people, your unemployment rate is 17%. Less than primary, it's 25. It's 32 for people who've completed primary. Some years of high school, 35. Completed high school, 27. And a post-school education, you drop the rate in half to 13%. As a share of all the unemployed people in the country, 47% sit in that category of kids who've had some years of high school education but never graduated. The second biggest component is people who have graduated from high school but haven't been able to go on and find employment. And immediately that youth profile that I showed you and how it will feed through the country's social, economic, and political system as older people tail off at the country's mortality rate. The implications of this, the strings start to tie themselves, bring themselves together. Stay with the question of unemployment. This time it's 94 at 5-year intervals, 99, 2004, 2009, 14, and where we find ourselves today. And the first thing I show you is the number of people in the country with a job. There's a counterintuitive thing going on here because the number started, it's off the right-hand axis, at just around 8 million, and it's doubled over the past 20 years. So the thesis of jobless growth that's thrown around even in South Africa's business press is wrong on the facts of it. And we have doubled the number of people with employment relative to the country that we inherited in 1994. It's a good sort of training story, this, for young analysts as well, to be careful about reaching firm conclusions of triumph and disaster on South Africa. Good analysts are those who can appreciate that our unemployment problem is one of the most serious of any emerging market, but that we've also made considerable progress in creating access to jobs for millions of people that did not have them before. And if you try and find in that tension clean success or complete failure, you're looking for the wrong thing. Good analysis and good strategy on South Africa is built by people who appreciate the truth in two apparently competing ideas, and that you've got to carry that inconsistency off in your mind. It's a line to walk. You'll never be on the right side of it, so don't try and balance it, but realize that both trends happen at the same time. And a demonstration of that is this. We doubled the number of people with a job, but look at the number of unemployed people over the same period, increasing from under 4 million to approaching 10 million. It increased even faster than the number of people with a job. And a lot of the reason for that is an indicator we call the labor market participation rate. It measures what proportion of people of working age participate in the labor market and look for work. That figure is very low at the end of the apartheid era. And as our economic recovery begins to build, I'm still going to take you through that recovery. More people realize work is available, jobs are being created, they enter the market looking for work, which means that technically they begin to be classified as unemployed. So trying to, again, find that sort of clean success and failure in this sort of data is something that is very difficult to do. Off the left-hand axis, despite the increase in the number of jobs, the unemployment rate for black South Africans, that's the one I show you here, has bounced around consistently between 25 and just over 30%. The increase in the rate was probably a positive indicator because it reflected more people entering the market because they knew there might be work and therefore being classified as unemployed. The decline in the rate into the global financial crisis year of 2009 is not necessarily a positive because it means many people exited the labor market where technically they were no longer classified as being employed. And the warning there is to be utterly careful about what you read in South Africa's mainstream media, because the interpretation of trends and data like this is never done particularly well. Move to white South Africans, and the unemployment rate over the past 20 years has been below the average of North America and Western Europe. Introduce the picture for colored South Africans and for Indian South Africans, and we still reflect a near perfect Verwoerdian segmentation of the country on an indicator as important as this, despite the progress we've made in doubling the number of people who are unemployed. We say sometimes to firms we work for that if we're done with you after the first few sessions and you feel you understand far less about the country than when we started, that we've probably got something right. My experience has been the deeper we drill into South African questions, the more we realize that we don't actually understand very much at all about what has changed or not changed in our country over the past 20 years. We classify people technically as unemployed if they are looking for work. If we take that away and we measure the unemployment rate instead in terms of people who are available for work and desire to work, even if they are not looking, we raise the unemployment rate considerably, which is what I show you here. Amongst people aged 15 to 24 who are available for work and want to work, so we take school children out of the data, the unemployment rate now is approaching a staggering 70%. It's an amazing number, considering the implications for the future of the country. On these trends, without breaking them, South Africa becomes a country in which half of people will never have the experience of working on an at all sustainable basis. It tracks into other issues that I'm sure some of you are involved in. One of those for us is work we did on family structures, where we found that less than half of children grow up in an environment where they see someone going to work every day and returning from work, and the implications for the sort of the molding of that young person are extraordinary. Amongst people 25 to 34, the expanded rate is 41. And then as people begin to drop out of the idea of working at all in South Africa, if you've been unemployed for 2 years, your chance of finding a job is very low. We see even the expanded rates starting to fall away. It doesn't mean the people in question necessarily have a job. In fact, it does not mean that at all. From how you participate in the economy through employment, we move to the next bit, which is your income and your earnings. And the first question that we try to supply an answer to, courtesy of Statistics South Africa, is where does your income come from? For Black South Africans, 63% of families, which we're measuring this time, say they get income from a salary, 13% from a business, 2% from what is in the main a private pension, and 48% get income from social welfare grants, mainly out of the state. You can add up to more than 100%, because you can get income from each of these. The pattern for colored households, similar to black. For Indian households, the departures are stark, particularly in terms of families getting an income from a business and a lesser dependency on social grants. And the pattern for white South Africans is an extreme version of the pattern for Indian South Africans. Social grants supporting the lifestyles of almost half of South African families are a double-edged sword. On the upswing, the political advantages are great, rolling out grants, increasing their value at rates above inflation. But on the downswing, when it becomes difficult to afford the grants, economic pressures build on households. Increases, even if they're in line with CPI, are not in line with the effective rate of inflation experienced by poor families. The political implications of grants it's the other end, it's the other side of the double-edged sword, and they become, as they are at the moment, starting to become a political liability for the government. From where your income comes from, we move to what your income is, and in this case, this evening, we show you what families spend in the country. Black families, half of them, 56%, report spending less than 2,500 Rand a month. Now, if you sit in very high towers in Sandton, I find that sometimes you become actually physically detached from the society around you. It's easy, it's seductive even, to fall into your enclave and imagine that the world around you is very much the world that you experience. And it's a hard reality to realize that for all the progress we have made as a country, we still remain a country in which life for comfortably half of families is one of pretty serious poverty. The pattern for colored South Africans, for Indian South Africans, again begins to differ. And ultimately, the pattern for white South Africans, the absolute inverse of the expenditure pattern as it relates to black South Africans. The next step out of incomes is to ask a related but separate question about what is your standard of living like. I start for you here off the right-hand axis with the number of families in the country that live in a formal house. The figure started at around 5 million in 1994 and will grow quickly to start approaching 14 million today, almost a threefold increase. Underneath that, the number of shacks, families living in shacks in the country. And for the first half of the era after 94, that number is falling. Second half of the era, it started to lift. But the striking thing is this, that for every shack newly built after 1994, almost 10 formal houses have been built in South Africa. And that jars with the impression created earlier in this briefing of a country that has made so little progress. And there's my point for you about being cautious about triumph and disaster in the South African analysis. There are very few emerging markets that can compete with the service delivery successes recorded by the ANC here, particularly in the first 10 to 15 years after 1994. I will show you later that in 1994, 50% of families didn't have electricity, and about a decade later, that figure had fallen to just 20%. Again, another number that on the sheer scale of what's been achieved here means that the living standards floor in the country has been lifted very quickly, even as failures in education and failures in access to the labor market have prevented many young people who have higher standards of living than their parents from finding their way into the formal economy where they can take the next step up the living standards ladder on their own. Now, concealed in this picture is something else. If we try and create an indicator to give us a sense of things, one thing we did is just to divide the number of shacks into the number of formal houses to see what would happen. And the result is this. In 94, divide shacks by formal houses, just to get a number. People also live in all sorts of other things. The data is amazing, tents and caravans and apartments and all manner of things. Shacks into formal houses in 94 is 25%. It will fall rapidly to just 15% by 2004, but that fall doesn't continue. We get a point where where this measure stagnates and in fact over time again begins to rise. And when we test this against other socio-economic measures, we find the same thing, a tale of two eras. The first 10 to 14 years, 13 years after 1994, considerable improvements on basic metrics such as clean water, electricity, years that you spend in schooling, etc. The second half of the era, we see stagnation and even the beginnings of reversals. And that became a key component of the long-term conclusions we draw about South Africa, in that the lazy, cliched analysis that everything's been a disaster since 1994, life is worse than when P.V. Botha stood in Durban in 1985, is wrong on the facts of it. We probably made more progress in the country in the first decade than we realize today, or what the government and the ANC was ever given credit for. But we interrupted that progress approximately a decade ago, and we pay a very heavy price for that. It's what we call the crisis of rising expectations. If you start the process of political and economic emancipation and halfway through interrupt it, you will be in more trouble than if you'd never started it at all, because the expectations curve continues to rise as it must. It's a good thing. But the ability of the economy to meet those expectations falls away, and as the gap opens between the two, you fill it with radical populism, the type of sentiment that frightens people and starts to weaken a society's social fabric. And that is our diagnosis. Unmet expectations based on the initial successes of the first decade explains where we find ourselves today, not the lazy cliche that there is nothing that has gone right here over the past 2 decades. We sometimes find ourselves, I think, so close to these issues that it is of great merit to step back from them and look over a much longer period of time to try and start identifying the trends and the cycles that determined the way that we experience the country, and also then to suggest how we may experience it in the future. What I do for you here is 1979 pushed all the way out to 2021. And the first thing I show you is South Africa's rate of economic growth. The 1980s have been completely catastrophic. 1, 2, 3, and a fourth year, we spend at growth rates that are negative or sitting on zero. In 1990, on a real per capita basis, inflation adjusted, we are 20% poorer than had been the case in 1980. The transition years are over here. And from 93, 94, we begin the process of rebuilding. We average a growth rate of 3% into 2003, and between 2004 and 2007, we grow the economy at an average rate of 5% for 4 consecutive years. The first time that had happened here since 1970, now almost 50 years ago. This little bump over here is not our fault, it's the Asian financial crisis. We'll fall with the world through the global financial crisis, bounce off the floor, but subsequently rates of growth will tail away. These are forecasts, but be warned that Treasury growth forecasts over the past decade have been wrong by approximately 50% most of the time. Be cautious before you base too many of your business or other decisions on what you see over here. I overlay this for you with the world's rate of economic growth. The instability of the late 70s has seen us depart from the global growth trajectory. They're sharply upwards. We are wallowing in a very difficult situation. But from 93, 94, the two trajectories will link up with each other again. We'll follow the world to our relative peaks through the crisis and back out, but only to the end of 2012. From that point, as the global recovery continued, our rate of economic growth fell away sharply downwards, repeating a pattern we'd last seen in the data in the late 1970s. We felt it very directly. This is personal income tax, now off the right-hand axis, as a share of the country's GDP. The desperate nationalist government laying on the burden on individual income taxpayers in an attempt to spend its way out of trouble as the economy implodes beneath it. The ANC comes to power over here, it inherits that momentum. But as we're freed from the Asian crisis and the economic recovery under Mbeki accelerates, the burden on individual income taxpayers falls. It will bump up here, that's 2009, the financial crisis. It's perfectly to be expected. But post that, as our growth rate peels away from the fragile global recovery, the burden on individual income taxpayers increases again reflecting a pattern we'd last seen in the late 1970s. Forced upon the government by this, which is corporate tax as a share of GDP, nowhere in the 80s growing strongly from the transition to our peak point, falling away through the financial crisis, never to recover again. That in turn reflects what we see in the budget deficit. How much more does the government spend than it earns? That is 1994, and the ANC has inherited a figure of almost negative 5%. 13 years later, though, we will record a budget surplus, a remarkable achievement for an emerging market, and something, again, that we never gave ourselves sufficient credit for at the time. But the global crisis will come along, and with it Mr. Zuma. And this very hard work, this pain and suffering, because that's what goes into this sort of data, is lost. And we again look at deficits on a par with what was the case at the end of the apartheid era. The reason is that levels of government revenue have continued to rise in the futile pursuit of levels of government expenditure, the yellow dots as a share of GDP, which have now reached a record all-time high point. Never before in the history of the country has the government spent this much of taxpayer, individual and corporate and other sources of revenue income in pursuit of implementing its policies. And the point of diminishing returns on tax increases is a point that is very far behind us. In and of itself, the difference between these, government expenditure and revenue, gives you the figure for the budget deficit, which you read off the left-hand axis of the graphic. Itself insufficient to meet demand, meaning that levels of government debt as a share of GDP have more than doubled over a decade to reach an all-time record high point. Consider that on coming to power, there's 1994, the ANC inherits from the Nats a debt level of 48%. By a decade or so later, they have knocked that, 13 years later, they've knocked that figure down to 27%. Government pays interest on its debt, as we all do, and the saving on the government's interest bill as debt was reduced was sufficient to finance the initial rollout of the social grants program. So the implications of the reversals are very serious. I think what stands out here for us is that even the advocates for Mr. Ramaphosa do him a disservice when they suggest that his coming to power and a few commissions are going to get South Africa to turn the corner. He has inherited economic circumstances on a par with what the National Party government left the ANC in 1994. But the ANC of Mandela and Mbeki essentially played the de facto role of prime minister under Mbeki. They had advantages Mr. Ramaphosa does not have. Interest rates in 1994 to 1998 are still sitting at levels of approaching and even exceeding 20%, and they will be cut in half, helping to drive the economic recovery. Household debt levels in this era are 25 percentage points lower than they are today. Mr. Mbeki has cheap surplus electricity, which Eskom has built in the 1970s for the 1980s based on the growth rates of the 1950s and the 1960s. The growth never materializes, so the energy is there. And this is before we even get to the commodity super cycle, which was of a nature that the world will never see again. Mr. Ramaphosa governs with none of those advantages, and the challenge facing him is far more serious, even the challenge facing the young ANC, newly in government, in the aftermath of the apartheid era. We start to get to the point that we almost sort of step off into what we call the void. And the purpose of a lot of this kind of work is to try and make our knowledge of the future almost as good as our knowledge of the past and our knowledge of the present. And one of the ways to step into that void of the unknown future is to take with you some of the key relationships that will help you understand cause and effect and the likely course of events that we confront in the years between now and the election in 2029. These help us. Economic growth. Since 1994, the now familiar pattern, hopefully to you, the Asian crisis, the peak, financial crisis, the bounce, the world has taken off and we've fallen away, and the Treasury's a forecast that you must be a little bit careful about. On top of that, the proportion of households that do not have electricity, a figure of 50% will become a figure of 20% a decade later. It's an extraordinary achievement. Then the figure will start to, the rate of decline will start to flatten, and in latter years, we will see a beginning of a reversal of some of the successes that we had initially recorded. Are you confident in the future of the country? A polling question. 6 out of 10 people say yes in 2009. A decade later, the figure has fallen to around 20%. ANC support in national elections over the same period, and we're very cautious about correlation or causation, so we don't go there. But when you start to see these kinds of figures starting to stack up against each other, it's perfectly justified to start asking yourself whether there's not something that is going on here. We are ourselves deeply skeptical of these conclusions. We try and convince ourselves the relationships aren't there. But I think there's a lot going on here between levels of ANC support, confidence in the future of the country, living standards, and it becomes one of the keys to the long-term future. We're going to get very deep into ANC support levels a few minutes from now. Off the left-hand axis, what proportion of protest action in the country is violent? 9% of protests were violent in 2010, 25% of protests are violent today, and these strings sort of come together and sort of match up with each other, and we get the beginnings of the stepping stones that we need to walk into that void. Behind it all, for me, the most critical single ingredient to the country's success is that the year-on-year change in the number of jobs in the country, and it follows, as it must, South Africa's rate of economic growth. And if you were to isolate yourself from South Africa completely for the next decade and be able to see only one indicator based on which you have to make the call of whether it was a success or whether it was far less successful than it might have been, I'd take that jobs indicator. Grow it strongly for the next decade, and you will have every ground to suggest that the country became a great success. Let it wallow at these relatively low levels, and we will face a lot of political instability, crisis of confidence, and rapidly changing political patterns and paradigms all around us. Then there's this. We call it the most powerful countervailing force in favor of the country's success. Contrary to what you read in newspapers, or most of them, and what you see on social media, South Africa is not a country that is divided against itself. We test public opinion. And one of the questions we ask is, do you think relationships between South Africans are better than was the case 20 years ago? In 2016, 54% of people said they thought things were better. 20% said they thought they were worse. You add them together, you're at 74. You're missing some people, and they're the people who said they're not sure about whether things have changed, but there's a strong majority in favor. 2017, 2018, and 2019. And considering the history, and considering the current inequalities, and considering the degree of racial nationalist incitement in the country today, it is a remarkable thing to think that even now, 6 out of 10 people in the cool, calm sort of their own homes, not fighting with each other at Spur or wherever these things happen, think that in fact relationships are better than they were before. The worsening trend over here is accounted for to a very great extent by minority opinion, coloured Indian and white South Africans, whose perspectives have shifted very rapidly over the past 3 years. Drill deeper into these data sets, there are many other questions, and I'm comfortable I'll stand up and fight it, that we talk about a country of 70 percenters, 80 percenters, that comfortably 7 to 8 out of 10 South Africans are in the same place on what they want from the future, how to get there, and that if you sit them down, they actually have a significant degree of respect and perhaps even affection for each other across lines of race and class. A comment, as ever, on the magnanimity of many black South Africans. Not an argument for complacency at all, but rather an argument to say that despite the daunting odds that face us, this is something we can rely on to buy us time to get through if we move rapidly enough, of course, to get through the decade that lies ahead in good shape and hopefully better shape than we are in today. But we've got to the point now where we can turn the corner out of what we know and can read and measure of our past and present and try and develop some knowledge about what's going to happen next. And the way we do that is the methodology eventually takes us to a point where we seek to identify forces or trends that are so influential that depending on how they play out over the next decade, they will have a definitive influence on all our lives. Inside the team, one of those at the moment is the question of ideological modernization. It's the closest we can get to summing up what we mean. A willingness on the part of influential authorities that would stretch from the NEC of the ANC through to business to acknowledge and identify that we need to do things fundamentally differently if we are going to reverse the trends that we've experienced over the past decade. Does that modernization happen in the face of potential political defeat, or does ideological stasis set in and it doesn't change? At the same time, is political authority devolved downwards into communities, or under pressure do we see a centralization of an ever more powerful and influential state? How we make those decisions as a country give us broad direction, sense of what might happen to us in the decade ahead. The best case is this: the rise of South Africa. The modernization happens under pressure, as it eventually did in the National Party itself, and delivered the decade and a bit of such great success that we've been through this evening already. And at the same time, that modernization brings around the idea that we need to devolve more authority into communities to make decisions about their own lives. Its opposite is that stasis sets in, and fearing defeat, the state seeks to centralize power in order to cut off whatever is coming at the pass. And that takes us into the fall, and hence the title of this briefing, The Rise or Fall of South Africa in the 2020s. But those are in some respects both plausible, but they're also both the cliches. It's the question asked by the foreign correspondents who traipse through our office and say to us, will it be the race war or the rainbow nation? And our stock answer is that those are perhaps two of the most unlikely outcomes for the next decade. There are more intriguing answers. One of them is the takeover of South Africa, We come under new management from outside, we'll talk about this in a moment, forces ideological modernization through becoming an increasingly centrist and forceful state. Tomorrow you have a chap talking to you about Singapore. The model and some of the philosophy behind this outcome is along those lines and not, of course, exactly the same. Or we could have the fragmentation of South Africa. Stasis sets in. The state loses its authority to govern over the society, and we break up into quasi-independent enclaves by necessity, devolving political authority down into communities who take it upon themselves to build islands of excellence, robust islands out of which they can grow, and South Africa can ultimately reach its great potential, but a very different avenue to what would happen in the rise. What do we mean by all of these? Take the detail on the rise of South Africa. Ideological modernization and devolved political authority. The trajectory, if we follow this path, will probably be something like this. Strong election result for Mr. Ramaphosa. The long game theorists and the New Dawn theorists were right. And on the back of that, Mr. Ramaphosa drives a series of reforms. Austerity, the labor market is deregulated, empowerment policy is reworked to do what it should do, which is to accelerate people on the basis of actual socio-economic disadvantage, out of poverty and into the middle classes. The private sector is positioned to rebuild the economy, giving the great expertise that exists within that sector relative to what exists in the civil service. Parents are given more control over what happens in the country's schools, given that they make better decisions about children than bureaucrats do, and taken to an extreme, we're able to vote for our station commander at the time of a local government election. And wouldn't that be, you can hold that guy to account. Wouldn't that just change the crime outlook in the communities we're in? You can call him back and throw him out if he doesn't live up. I mean, society everyone might elect Genghis Khan to be their station commander. But we'd become a very safe society very quickly, I think. Follow that type of trajectory, having locked up the corrupt politicians and the like, confidence is back. We're lifting towards that trajectory we last experienced between 2004 and 2007, and the world we live through will be something like this. 2018 to 2030, the unemployment rate, officially 27%, will be more than cut in half, and in the next decade to 2040, it will be under 10%. The ANC has modernized, so it's been able to capture the imagination of younger, better educated urban voters, and it has a comfortable majority. And all of it made possible by an economic recovery that sees the growth rate ratchet up to average between 5 and 6% by the end of the decade, a necessary condition to break the structural unemployment crisis, create a more prosperous society. It is a perfectly plausible outcome, despite everything we face today. And if you doubt me, just remind yourself about P.W. Botha to Martinus van Schalkwyk, and you'll know that these things can happen. And if that one doesn't work well enough for you, because you might be a bit younger, consider this, that now 10, 11 years ago, if you stood in the mall in Washington, D.C., and you saw Mr. Obama make that first speech where he said, yes, we can, to 1 million people, and if you walked down that mall, you'll know what an impressive coliseum it can be. And on hearing him say that in his first speech, you turn to your mate and you say to him, you know what, it sounds great, but the next man to stand there will be Donald Trump. And don't write off implausible futures. The impossible, people say it's impossible. My analyst ears prick up. The impossible happens very often, in fact, in the sort of field we work in. It's there. But this might also be our future. We make the wrong decisions. What's happened is that, again, there's been a strong showing, but the state capture suspects, the racial nationalists, the ideologues, the crooks and the thugs have used that to embolden themselves and drive Mr. Ramaphosa and the reformists out of the ANC. What follows is a swift assault on property rights, already set up in the expropriation bill of this time, which is one of the most dangerous and insidious pieces of legislation our country has ever faced. That property rights erosion sets up a sharp erosion in civil liberties and the rule of law, given that property rights anchor substantive human freedom in every free and open society. What follows from that is significant rights abuses, as people who realize they've been duped try and move against the state, not a revolution, but just drive back at it, and they get knocked down with great ferocity and violence. Consider that at Marikana, 30+ mine workers are shot dead, and no single politician or senior police officer has been held accountable for that. And do not doubt that the capacity to use extreme violence against South Africa's citizens exists within the present government. Violence accelerates capital and skills flight. The currency a precipitous decline. Wealth extraction becomes the purpose of government policy over wealth creation. The government mortgages our futures to an external creditor. You can have the Marangi diamond fields in Zimbabwe if you bail out ZANU-PF for a couple of years. We slip into a decade-deep recession, steep decline in living standards, and join the ranks of failed post-colonial African states. 2018 to 2030, the unemployment rate has doubled. The ANC, almost defeated, gets a big fright in 2024 and acts aggressively and with determined fashion in order to make sure that can never happen. And we've slipped into a decade-deep recession, eroding so much of the progress we had made to date. Don't be the Venezuelans who said it couldn't happen, or the Zimbabweans who said that they didn't think it was possible, but it happened to them. It's a real possibility for us now, and one that we must work very hard to guard against. Then we get the third option, the takeover of South Africa, external modernization, centralization of authority, and we become successful. The trajectory is this. Regardless of the election result, little by way of reform comes out of the ANC or Mr. Ramaphosa's camp. We get instead gimmicks, youth employment schemes and sovereign wealth funds and a myriad of investment conferences. If having an investment conference grew the economy, we would be one of the fastest growing emerging markets in the world today. The result is that stagnation sets in and stability slowly deteriorates. Then the inflection point. Amidst this, we see a significant pullback in the global economy. US, Eurozone, G7 and Chinese growth rates have all peaked and have all begun to dip. The pace of those dips, held back by accommodative monetary and fiscal policy stimulus of a sort. US equity markets hit a series of 2 to 3 peaks in 2018, whereas Mbeki came to power at the beginning of a global lift that helped him stage the recovery here. Mr. Ramaphosa's disadvantage again is that he comes to power at a point when global peaks have been reached, and we're starting to already see slippage in growth rates of major economies. That pullback exposes our own weaknesses, brings on the fiscal cliff. We've run out of money to govern the country. And at that point, a very important thing happens that turns the picture around. There emerges an external benefactor, either a sovereign, a country, or either or perhaps the International Monetary Fund that takes management control of the country away from the present government. Essentially, the budget speech is written in a foreign capital and introduces thereby the reforms necessary to begin to rebuild. Desperate at the prospects of defeat, the ANC is willing to surrender policy sovereignty to live another day. Should that happen, the trajectory probably looks like this. Unemployment has lifted, great disappointment on the back of the 2019 election. There's the intervention of the foreign party. The ANC is almost defeated. It's definitely going to lose in 2029, and therefore it's able to accept any conditions in order to survive. We've slipped into a recession as global circumstances deteriorated, but under new management, we will grow out of that growth rate 3 to 3.5% at the end of the decade, setting up a very strong decade in the 2030s and 40s. And we will stand on these relative peaks or those later to come and look back at this moment, tell younger people that you don't know how close it was to disaster in exactly the same way that those who can remember the era stand on the peaks we achieved as a country in 2007, point back to the 1980s and say you've actually got no idea how we almost wrote ourselves off, but we ultimately made sensible decisions. And lastly, there's this, the fragmentation of South Africa. What's happened here is that factionalism and modernist, traditionalist tensions in the ANC have proven to be too great to overcome. It is already past the point of no return for that party. Growth underperforms post the election, job creation stagnates, the real value of welfare grants falls, and patronage is no longer affordable as fiscal implications kick in. Your loyalty to the ANC is no longer sufficient to give you access to the state through the sort of Bosasa type shenanigans that are now starting to be, thankfully, exposed. When that happens, the last thing that was holding the ANC together breaks. It turns on itself, accelerating its demise. It loses the election in 2024, and South Africa faces a new era of coalition government. 2, 3, 4 parties, perhaps, are making up a national majority. We don't know if that works, given that one party with a 60% majority has found it difficult to take firm decisions about turning the country around. Put 4 or 5 of them together, and given the state of most of them, almost all without exception, and to think that they're going to agree on what to do, unlikely. The result is this, that the state becomes ever weaker, runs out of money, lacks clear authority, and it begins to withdraw its authority. Right across the country, you can sort of picture the withdrawal of state authority until eventually the government that sits in the union buildings rules only over the union buildings, and the gardens and the fence outside is sort of the border, and they're too afraid to venture out lest they encounter a member of the public. What happens then, we think, is interesting. The likelihood is that South Africa splits into 4 separate entities, de facto independent little enclaves. One of those will be corrupt, localized political fiefdoms, where some political chap is able to extract some wealth about the world about him. The second community will be near feudal rural fiefdoms, a throwback to the sort of homeland approach of the apartheid government, enforced by the state for the very same reasons it was introduced in the first place. Near feudal rural fiefdoms. Then the urban peripheries, gang-controlled urban slums, South American favelas, the sort of Western Cape is already starting to demonstrate that quite strongly. And lastly, there will be private middle-class enclaves, a Stain City, the sort of waterfall estates, Val de Vie, the polo estate at Paarl, the golf estates of George. These will be independent little countries. We've already moved through a series of these enclaves. Generation 1 was when the first fences were put around a suburb. Generation 2, you put services inside those fences. Generation 3 are the purpose-built medieval villages that many people live in today. A Stain City would be an example of one. It is the medieval model. You build a huge wall and line it with security people and a massive gate, and everyone who can afford to lives inside to shield themselves from the world outside. And we're already at a point with some of these where you can be born and die in some of them, and you would never have to see the world outside and know what you could walk on the wall now and again and sort of have a look, and sort of recoil in horror and go back inside. And 4th generation enclaves are coming. And what happens there is that these disparate little ones network to each other. Technological innovation, crypto and cyber currencies and the like. And collectively they represent little dots on the map of islands of excellence, of wealth, of prosperity, collectively home to 7 million people that as a group will represent one of the most exciting emerging markets anywhere in the world. They will cross-subsidize the society because they still pay tax, preventing a fall away into a Venezuelan horror. And what we wonder might happen then is whether they, as independent entities, separate from a failed centrist state, might become the little nuclei of reform and development, strong, independent, robust. They will begin to grow their influence, and over time, 2 or 3 decades, as they expand, it will be out of those nuclei that South Africa will eventually rise to meet its great potential. The next decade, under that outlook, unemployment flat. The line looks like that for much of the past decade. The ANC defeated, and it becomes a 30% party by the end of this decade. Growth looks volatile, but the wavelength is very tight, and the positive or negative position depends on what's happening in the global economy. But what's being created here, enclaves, will be at the global cutting edge of enclave formation. And while they'll be written off initially as elitist bolt holes that are at odds with the type of society we want to be, later will understand that they became the independent little nuclei that built a better world around them. In some respects, when Trevor came to see me and he described this place, it represents in many respects exactly that. People who've decided to take upon themselves the responsibilities for building a better society. First, make yourselves strong and robust. Otherwise, you're not going to withstand the pressures of the next decade. Once you've done that, you can use what you've created here to have an incredibly positive influence on the world around you. We don't think there's a fifth view, and South Africa's future will fall within the confines of one of these four. There's more than enough information to know on the sort of 36-month view which one it's going to be. And on the 120-month view, there is more than enough information available now to make sure that even if you might not be precisely right about the future, you are unlikely to be taken by surprise and proved to be wrong. And with that in hand, I think I've had the experience of doing this briefing very many times, and you get two audience reactions. One lot are horrified and say it's terrifying, we can't possibly do it. Another lot say it's quite a lot to take in, it's very harsh, but we can face it down, we can beat it, and we can grow a better country. Those companies, they're mainly that, are firms that we think do very well in a future South Africa. And I thank you for listening to me tonight. And in what time you allow, I'll answer questions. Thank you.